The night they presented Elizabeth Khan to Smith Ray as though she were a punchline, she was wearing borrowed silk and a composure so complete it had ceased to be performance and become armour. Lord Percival Knott had arranged it with the particular creativity of a man who mistakes cruelty for wit. 12 guests at Thorngate Hall, port moving in the candlelight, and then the doors opening, and a footman announcing her name with perfect solemnity while the room dissolved into laughter. The ruined Miss Khan. What a gift for the Duke who has everything and wants nothing. She walked in as though she had been the one to send the invitation. That was the first thing Smith noticed. Not the borrowed silk, not the delicate arrangement of her dark hair, not the particular pallor that came from being the object of a room's contempt. He noticed that her chin had not dropped a single degree since the doors opened, that her hands were still at her sides, that she moved toward the empty chair beside the fire with the unhurried deliberateness of a woman who had decided, somewhere between the corridor and the threshold, that she would not give them the falling apart they had come to witness. The second thing he noticed was that she was looking directly at him, not with the pleading of someone hoping to be rescued, not with the humiliation of someone who wished to be invisible, with the clear, measuring regard of someone cataloguing an unknown quantity and reserving judgment. He found he could not look away. 18 months ago, Elizabeth Khan had been the most sought correspondent in 2 counties, quick-minded, quietly funny, from the sort of woman who made drawing rooms feel less like performances and more like conversations. Then Lord Knott had spoken 4 sentences to the right people at the wrong moment, and the world had decided, with its usual efficiency, that she was nothing. She had spent those 18 months becoming something considerably more dangerous than nothing. She sat down, accepted tea from a stunned footman, and said pleasantly, into a silence thick enough to cut, "Lord Knott, you look exactly as I remember. I've been told grief changes a man, but you seem entirely unaffected." Nobody laughed. The Duke of Varn set down his glass. This, he thought, for the first time in 2 years of relentless, purposeless evenings, is going to be interesting. The silence following Elizabeth's remark lasted precisely long enough to be satisfying. Our Lord Knott recovered first, because men of his particular construction always did. "Miss Khan," he said, with the measured warmth of someone who had practiced charms so long it had replaced feeling entirely. What a remarkable surprise. "Is it?" Elizabeth accepted a second cup of tea from the still stunned footman. "You sent the carriage?" More silence. Lord Hartby, seated to Knott's left, covered his mouth with a napkin. Whether to conceal amusement or horror, Elizabeth neither knew nor particularly cared. Smith Ray had not moved. He sat at the far end of the table with the particular stillness of a man who had learned long ago that stillness was its own form of power. That silence, properly maintained, made other people say far more than they intended. He was 34, dark-haired, built with the kind of angular sea Elizabeth that portraiture flattered and candlelight complicated. The ton called him cold. His own mother, on 3 separate recorded occasions, had called him unreachable. He was watching Elizabeth Khan the way a man watches something he cannot yet classify. She did not look at him again. This was deliberate. She had learned in 18 months of careful reconstruction that the most effective way to hold a man's attention was to appear entirely unbothered by whether you had it. Dinner was served. Conversation resumed, thin, skating carefully around the spectacle of her presence. Elizabeth ate her soup and spoke pleasantly to the man beside her, a minor baronet named Culworth, who was so visibly nervous in her company that she almost felt sorry for him. Almost. When the fish course arrived, she felt it, the precise, measurable weight of Smith Ray's gaze moving across the table toward her, like a hand reaching through dark water. She did not turn, but she noted it, the way she noted everything now, every debt, every witness, every open door. Thorngate's library was the one room Elizabeth had always loved without reservation. She had grown up 30 miles east in a house that smelled of damp stone and her father's pipe tobacco, and she had visited Thorngate twice as a girl when Nott's father still lived, and the estate had been something warmer than it was now. The library had been the same then, floor to ceiling, chaotic with geography and philosophy and the particular smell of books that had been read rather than displayed. She slipped inside after the ladies withdrew from dinner, before the drawing-room could close around her like a well-meaning trap. She did not hear him enter. She only became aware of him when he spoke. "Nott will make you pay for that remark at dinner." She did not turn from the shelf immediately. "He already has," she said. 18 months ago. He found it considerably cheaper the first time. A pause. She heard him move further into the room, away from the door. "You know what he told people?" It was not a question. "I know exactly what he told people." Now she turned. Smith Ray stood near the window, his expression carrying the neutral precision of a man who had trained himself out of visible reaction. He told them I had formed an inappropriate attachment to a married gentleman in Derbyshire and been quietly removed from society for it. He told them I was desperate and dishonest and had invented an understanding where none existed. And the truth? The question surprised her. Not its content. She had expected curiosity, but the directness of it. Men of his rank rarely asked for truth. They inferred it, reshuffled it, used it as currency. "The truth," she said, "is considerably more useful to me while it remains mine." Smith studied her for a long moment. The fire threw shadows across the high planes of his face. "You came tonight for a reason." "Everyone comes somewhere for a reason, Your Grace." She replaced the book she was holding. "The interesting question is whether you can work out what mine is before I've finished using it." She left him standing in the library with that, and felt his attention follow her all the way down the hall. 18 months ago, Elizabeth Khan had been engaged. Not formally. There had been no announcement, no ring, no meeting of solicitors. But Lord Nott had spoken words in a garden in July that constituted a promise in every language that mattered, and she had believed them because she had known him since childhood and had considered herself a reasonable judge of character. She had been wrong about that last part. What she had not known, in July, was that Nott was in debt to the kind of men who did not send polite letters, that he had spent 3 years cultivating the acquaintance of Sir Edmund Forrest's family, that Forrest's eldest daughter came attached to a settlement that would dissolve every obligation not carried, and that the settlement was contingent on Forrest's approval of the match, which required Nott to present himself as unencumbered. The unencumbered meant Elizabeth needed to not exist. He had been elegant about it, which was the part she found she could not entirely forgive. Not the cruelty. Cruelty she had expected from the world in various forms. It was the craftsmanship. He had constructed a story that required her complicity in her own ruin. The married gentleman in Derbyshire was real, a distant cousin of her mother's whom she had corresponded with on entirely ordinary terms. Nott had taken those letters and summarized them out of context for 3 carefully chosen conversations in 3 consecutive drawing rooms. By the time the version reached London, she was brazen and deluded and not quite respectable. By the time it reached her own county, she was something worse. She was pitiable. She had spent the first 3 months being pitied. She had spent the following 15 understanding exactly what she intended to do about it. What she intended required proximity to Nott. It required a witness of sufficient rank that his testimony would be irrefutable, and it required that she remain, throughout, entirely composed, that she give no one any reason to dismiss her as a woman acting from wounded feeling. She was not acting from wounded feeling. She was acting from something considerably colder and more durable than that. She found him on the east lawn before breakfast, which she had not anticipated Smith Ree walked his estates at dawn. She learned this later from Thorngate's housekeeper, who mentioned it with the faint pride of someone describing a known eccentricity. That morning, she had simply gone out for air and found him standing at the low stone wall that bordered the kitchen garden, looking at nothing in particular, with the focused attention of a man working through a problem. He heard her on the gravel path and turned. "You're up early," he said. "I sleep badly in other people's houses." She came to stand beside him, leaving a proper distance between them, looking out at the pale grey of the early sky. "You walk every morning?" "It's the only part of the day that belongs entirely to me." She understood that. The precision of it, the deliberate claiming of a single hour before rank and obligation resumed. She had done something similar in the years before not. She had written letters in the early morning before anyone required anything of her. She did not write letters anymore. "You haven't told Not that you spoke to me last night," she said. It was not a question. She had watched them at breakfast and read the absence of conspiratorial exchange between them. "No." "Why not?" Smith looked at her sideways. The morning light was unforgiving in the way that only early autumn managed, stripping everything of warmth, leaving contour and bone. He looked, she thought, like a man who had been left in a cold room for long enough that he had stopped expecting the temperature to change. "Because whatever you're doing," he said, "I want to see how it ends." The honesty of it landed unexpectedly. She had prepared for condescension, for the polite management one offered ruined women in borrowed silk. She had not prepared for this, for being seen clearly and treated as though clarity were a courtesy rather than a threat. It ends badly for someone," she said. "Yes." He turned back to the garden. "I gathered that." They were thrown together by Thorngate's geography and Not's oblivious confidence. Not believed with the comfortable certainty of a man who had never properly examined his own assumptions that Elizabeth was there because she was desperate, that 18 months of social death had reduced her to accepting whatever invitation arrived, even one offered as sport. He treated her accordingly, with the absent-minded generosity one extended to a creature that had been sufficiently defanged. He seated her beside Smith at every dinner. He included her in every excursion. He pointed her out to his guests with the fond condescension of a collector displaying something interesting for its oddity. He did not notice what was happening between them. What was happening was this. They were talking, not the careful, managed conversation of drawing rooms, where every exchange served a social purpose and sincerity was considered slightly embarrassing. They talked the way people talk when they have both, at different points and for different reasons, stopped caring what impressions they made, directly, with the occasional cruelty of genuine honesty, and with a growing mutual attention that neither of them had named, because naming it would require acknowledging that it had begun. On the third afternoon, walking the lower path while Not's other guests played cards inside, Smith said, without preamble, "What did he take from you, beyond the reputation?" She was quiet for several paces. The path ran alongside a low hedge, the smell of late roses carried on the air, almost overripe. "The assumption of good faith," she said finally. "I had believed, not naively, I thought, but practically, that people who said true things to you in gardens meant them. I don't believe that anymore." "And yet you're here." "I'm here precisely because I no longer believe it." She glanced at him. "I'm not waiting to be rescued, Your Grace. I'm waiting to collect." He did not ask collect what. She had the distinct impression he already knew. That evening, when their hands came within 2 inches of each other, reaching for the same lamp in the corridor, and neither of them moved away immediately, she noted it, the warmth of proximity, the awareness of his breathing, and then she filed it away in the part of herself she had designated for things she could not yet afford to feel. Smith had not come to Thorngate to involve himself in anyone's reckoning. He had come because Knott had extended the invitation 3 times, and declining a 4th time required a reason, and Smith had found himself without one, which was itself a symptom of the particular emptiness that had been his primary companion since his brother's death 2 years prior. He attended things now not because he wanted to, but because wanting had become difficult to locate, like a room in a house he knew well that had somehow changed its position in the dark. Elizabeth Kahn had not changed the emptiness, but she had, with considerable efficiency, made him interested in something outside of it. He knew things about Knott that Elizabeth did not. He knew, for instance, that the marriage to Forrest's daughter had lasted 11 months before the girl had quietly returned to her father's house in Kent, and that the settlement money had been absorbed so completely that nothing remained of it. He knew that Knott was again in debt, not to the manageable sort of creditor who sent letters, but to a man named Corve whose patience was expressed in property liens and sudden illnesses among one's livestock. He knew that Knott had invited him specifically because Smith's presence at a gathering elevated it, that he was, in Knott's calculus, a form of social currency to be spent. What he had not anticipated was Elizabeth. He sat in his room on the 4th night and examined what he felt with the methodical care he applied to everything, because carelessness had cost him before, and he had resolved not to repeat the education. What he found was not simple, it was compound. Admiration laid over attraction laid over something that had no clean name, a something that had begun the moment she'd walked into that room in borrowed silk and refused to perform her own humiliation for their entertainment. She was collecting, she had said. He thought about what he could give her that she hadn't been able to take herself. He thought about it for a long time, in the dark, while the house settled around him. Then he made a decision that surprised him, which, after 2 years of feeling nothing in particular, he recognized as significant. Smith found her the following morning before the rest of the house had stirred, in the same spot on the east lawn where their first real conversation had taken place. He had the impression she came there by habit now, and that the habit had formed around the possibility of him, which was either vanity on his part or accurate observation, and he had learned to trust his observations. "I know what Knott owes," he said, without preamble, "and to whom." She turned. Her expression did not open with relief or gratitude, which he had half expected and half dreaded. Instead, she studied him with the careful attention she brought to everything, measuring the offer against its cost. "How long have you known?" "The particulars? 2 days? The general shape of him?" He looked toward the hedge line, where morning mist still gathered in the low places. "Since the second dinner. Men like Knott have a specific quality of attention when they're afraid. They become very warm." "He's been exceptionally warm to you all week." "Yes." He paused. "A man named Corve holds liens against 3 of his tenant properties. Knott needs a significant sum by December, or he loses the eastern parcels, which would make the estate unviable. He invited me because he intends to ask me for it." Elizabeth was quiet for a moment. A wood pigeon called somewhere in the elms, unhurried and indifferent to everything happening beneath it. "And will you give it to him?" Smith looked at her directly. "That depends entirely on what you need from me." She held his gaze, and he watched something in her face move through several calculations, wariness, assessment, and underneath both of those something rawer that she had disciplined almost completely out of his ability. Almost. "I need a witness," she said, "someone whose word cannot be dismissed, discredited, or bought. I need someone present when Knott tells the truth about what he did, because he will tell it. I know exactly how to make him, but without corroboration, it counts for nothing." "And in exchange?" She looked at him steadily. "In exchange, you'll have done the right thing. I understand that may be novel, but I'm told one adjusts." The ghost of something crossed his face, not quite amusement, but adjacent to it, and warm in a way that the rest of him rarely was. "Tell me the plan," he said. She told him that evening in the library, with the fire low and the house occupied elsewhere with cards and Knott's particular brand of loud, shallow hospitality. The plan was elegant in the way that the best plans were, not complicated, but precisely fitted to its subject, like a key cut for a specific lock. Knott had one reliable weakness beyond money, and that was his need to be believed the smartest man in a room. He had built the lie about Elizabeth not through elaborate forgery or bribery, but through the simple mechanism of a story well told to the right audience. And stories well told required a teller who believed in his own performance, who, given the right conditions, would perform again. Elizabeth had written a letter. She showed it to Smith, a single page in her own hand, addressed to Knott, and constructed with surgical care to suggest that she had evidence of the original deception, the actual letters to her mother's cousin, annotated in Knott's hand to demonstrate how he had reframed them. The evidence was real. She had kept everything. But the letter implied she intended to use it publicly, immediately, without negotiation. "He'll come to you," she said. "Not to me. He'll never come directly to me. It would require him to acknowledge that I'm a threat rather than a jest. He'll come to you, because you're the only person here whose opinion he actually fears losing." Smith read the letter again. "And when he comes to me?" "You let him explain himself." Her voice was perfectly level. "You ask him questions. You express skepticism. You make him work for your belief." She met his eyes. "And you remember every word." A silence settled between them, close and complicated. "You've been planning this for 18 months, he said. "I've been surviving for 18 months, she corrected quietly. "The planning only required a witness. I didn't have one until now." He handed the letter back. Their fingers did not quite touch, but the near miss of it registered in the space between them like a held note. "Send it in the morning," he said. Knott came to him on the second day, as predicted. He arrived at Smith's door after supper with a bottle of excellent port and the careful, managed bonhomie of a man who needed something and intended to take the long way toward asking for it. Smith let him pour 2 glasses and deliver 12 minutes of pleasantries about the grouse season, before he said, with the mild patience of someone waiting for a performance to reach its point, "She wrote to you." Knott's hand, lifting his glass, did not falter. He had good nerves. Smith would grant him that. A peculiar letter. The woman has clearly constructed some sort of narrative around a very ordinary. "She has the originals," Smith said. "The letters to Hartfield, with your annotations." The fire crackled. Knott set his glass down with the controlled care of a man preventing his hands from doing something revealing. "I don't know what she's told you." "She's told me nothing." Smith leaned back in his chair, entirely still. "Which is how I know it's true. Fabricated grievances come with elaborate explanation. Genuine ones come with evidence and silence." The silence that followed was a different quality from all the silences that had preceded it that week. It had weight. It had the specific density of a man understanding for the first time that the ground he was standing on had been moved without his knowledge. "She was unsuitable," Knott said finally. The word came out stripped of its earlier confidence. The attachment was real enough on her side. I had simply made promises you intended to keep until they became inconvenient. Smith's voice did not rise. It never needed to. And when they became inconvenient, you disassembled her reputation with 3 conversations and a handful of letters taken out of their context, and then you invited her here as entertainment. Knott said nothing. I want to understand something, Smith continued. Not for her sake, for my own clarity. Did you know, when you constructed it, that it would end her completely? Or did you simply not consider it at all? The question hung in the room. Nott's answer, the long, terrible pause before he reached for his port rather than respond, was more honest than anything he might have said. Elizabeth was in the morning room when Smith found her, 3 hours later. She was at the writing desk, not writing, sitting with her hands folded and her gaze on the middle distance, in the posture of someone who had set something down after carrying it for a very long time and was not yet certain how to stand without its weight. He closed the door. "He confirmed it?" she asked. Not in words that could be repeated in a court of law. Smith crossed to the window and stood with his back to the glass, facing her. But in every way that will matter to the people whose opinion he has spent 3 years cultivating. He paused. I left him understanding that I would be sharing what I know with Lord Hartby, Sir Culworth, and the Forsyth family, who I believe have a daughter Nott has recently been attentive toward. Elizabeth absorbed this. Something moved across her face that was not triumph. It was quieter and more complicated than triumph, the way the end of pain rarely feels like joy and more often feels like the slow, bewildering return of sensation to a limb long held still. The Forsyth family, she said. The eldest daughter is 17. I thought they should know the shape of his character before any understanding developed. She looked at him for a long moment. You didn't have to include that. No. He held her gaze. I included it because it was right, not because it served the plan. The distinction mattered to her. He could see it in the slight alteration of her expression, the way she recalibrated something internally. She had spent 18 months in a world where every kindness had a mechanism, and every gesture concealed an invoice. He understood, watching her receive a thing done simply because it was right, that this was what Nott had actually taken from her. Not the reputation, the ability to receive goodness without bracing for its cost. He'll leave tomorrow, she said. He won't be able to stay, knowing you know. He was gone in his own mind the moment I named the Forsyths. She nodded slowly. Then, with the careful deliberateness of someone making a decision they had been approaching for days, "Thank you, Smith." His given name, spoken for the first time, landed in the room like something fragile and irreversible. He did not move toward her. He understood that she was not ready for that, and that she was worth the patience of waiting until she was. "Don't thank me yet," he said. "Society still believes what it believes." "Society," she said, "is about to have its education." Nott left Thorngate the following morning with the compressed efficiency of a man outrunning something he could not name. His departure was noted by every guest present, and its abruptness, no farewell dinner, no extended courtesy, simply a carriage called at 7 and a terse note left with the butler, carried its own eloquence. By the time the remaining guests sat down to breakfast, the note had been mentioned by 3 people and read, in spirit if not in letter, by all of them. Smith said nothing at breakfast. He did not need to. He had spent the previous evening in 3 separate conversations that had not been about Nott at all, and had therefore been entirely about him, the kind of social surgery that required no instruments beyond the precise placement of a raised eyebrow and a thoughtful pause. He was very good at raised eyebrows and thoughtful pauses. Elizabeth sat across the table and ate her eggs and said almost nothing, and he watched the room orient itself around her differently, not with the morbid curiosity they had brought on the first night, but with something approaching reassessment. She had walked into Thorngate as Nott's jest, and was leaving it as a woman who had outlasted him on his own ground. That afternoon, as the party dispersed to their various carriages and obligations, Lord Heartby stopped beside her on the front steps with his hat in his hand and said, with the uncomfortable sincerity of a man confronting a belated conscience, I laughed. That first night, I want you to know I'm not proud of it. I know, she said pleasantly. I counted. He blinked. She smiled, entirely genuinely, and stepped past him toward the waiting carriage. Smith was at the carriage already, because he had arranged for them to share the road as far as the Mileham crossroads, which was 11 miles, and he had calculated sufficient. You counted, he said, as the carriage moved off. Of course I counted. She looked at him sideways, and the afternoon light was kind in the way that autumn sometimes surprised you by being. I count everything. It's very useful for knowing where to start. And where do you start with me? The question was quieter than his others. It came from a different place, not strategic, not careful, but unguarded in the way that things occasionally escaped him when his attention was divided between what he meant to say and what was actually true. She looked at him for a long moment. I start, she said finally, by not counting at all. They did not fall into each other's arms in the carriage, which was the correct choice, and also Smith thought, the only choice either of them was truly capable of making. They had both been made cautious by different kinds of loss, and caution, properly applied, was not the enemy of feeling, but its guardian. What they did was talk. They talked for 11 miles without stopping, about his brother, whose death had hollowed out a specific chamber in him that he had been papering over with obligation and attendance at other people's house parties. About her father, who had believed Nott's version of events because it required less difficulty than believing his daughter, and with whom she had not spoken in 14 months. About the strange, clarifying quality of being publicly dismissed, how it sorted one's acquaintances with a ruthlessness that no deliberate audit could have achieved. At the Mileham crossroads, the carriage stopped. Neither of them moved immediately. I have a house in Norfolk, he said. Serviceable, quiet, 11 miles from anything requiring attendance. He paused. I intend to spend the winter there, working out what I actually want from the remainder of my life, and now that I've remembered wanting is possible. Elizabeth looked at the crossroads through the carriage window, one road running north toward her aunt's house in Reston, where she had been staying with the compressed gratitude of someone accepting shelter while building an exit. The other running east. Is that an invitation? She asked. It's an honest statement of my intentions, he said, with an implication I thought you'd find less alarming than a direct question. The corner of her mouth moved. I would need my own rooms, naturally. And I would need it understood that I am there because I choose to be, not because I have nowhere else. I would find it insulting if you were there for any other reason. She turned from the window and looked at him, really looked, in the way she rarely permitted herself, and without the protective layer of assessment between her gaze and its object. He looked back. No performance, no management, just a man who had learned in 11 miles that he would rather be honest with her than convincing to anyone else. East, then, she said. The carriage moved. Lord Percival Nott's exit from Thorngate was not, as he had hoped, the quiet retreat of a man reordering his affairs. Smith was precise and unhurried about what he shared and with whom, and the result was not a scandal. Scandals were loud and brief and half forgotten by spring. What Nott faced was something slower and more permanent, a gradual, thorough revision of the way rooms arranged themselves when he entered them. Invitations arrived with increasing infrequency. The Forsyth family declined his call. The man named Corve denied the social connection he had been promised as partial payment against the debt called in his liens in January. The eastern parcels went first. By March, Nott had let the main house and was living, with compressed dignity, in the dower cottage at the edge of what had been his estate. Nobody wrote about it. That was the particular mercy, or punishment, depending on how one measured, of the thing. There was nothing to write. He had simply become a man whom careful people had quietly decided to know less well. He understood in the cottage what he had actually done. Not the abstract moral weight of it, which had never troubled him, but the mechanical truth. He had underestimated Elizabeth Carner because she was a woman without resources, and she had used that assumption as a door he had courteously left open for her. The comprehension did not make him sorry, but it made him careful, afterward, in ways he had never been before. Small mercies. Elizabeth Carn spent the winter in Norfolk. She had her own rooms as agreed, and she filled them with books ordered from a London cellar and correspondence she had been deferring for 2 years. She walked in the mornings. She slept without the tight vigilance that had been her constant companion since July of the previous year. She wrote to her father, not a reconciliation, not yet, but an opening toward one, which was all she could honestly offer and more than she had managed in 14 months. She and Smith argued about everything: politics, philosophy, the proper stewardship of neglected gardens, whether Norfolk winters were clarifying or simply bleak. He was wrong often enough to be interesting and honest enough to admit it, which she found, to her own surprise, increasingly difficult to protect herself against. By February, she had stopped trying. They married in April, in the village church near the Norfolk house, with no announcement in the papers and no guest list beyond the housekeeper and a neighbouring family who had somehow become friends over the course of a particularly argumentative dinner in January. Elizabeth wore a dress she had chosen herself in a shade of deep gold that suited her and that no one had selected on her behalf. There was no performance in it. Smith held her hand throughout the ceremony, with the focused attention he brought to everything he had decided mattered, and when the rector pronounced them married, he looked at her with an expression she had come to recognize, not the careful neutrality he showed the world, but the open, undefended face of a man who had stopped bracing for the temperature to change. She kept counting, always. It was useful, and she was honest about her nature. But she stopped counting with him. She had told him so at the Milam crossroads, and she kept that promise with the same precision she brought to everything else, completely, and for the rest of her life. If this story stayed with you, if there was a moment that made you catch your breath or feel the sharp edge of what it costs to rebuild yourself when someone has taken something that was not theirs to take, please subscribe to the channel and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. It amazes me to know how far these stories travel.